Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Underneath podcast / live stream. I have with me today, I'm so excited, my good friend Larry Chapp, who is still in Rome. And we thought that it would just be impossible to leave our first two portions of the trilogy unfinished. Now that we have a pope. So, Larry, welcome back, my friend. How are you?
I am doing very well. I'm really loving my time in Rome, although I am ready to go home. And I am between first things, Catholic World Report, the National Catholic Register, and the Pillar. I'm sick and tired of writing about things papal. I don't mind talking about it, but writing about it, I mean, it's just so repetitive. And everybody's saying the same thing. And it's basically everybody's racing for clickbait on anything related to Pope Leo.
Sure. So, look, last time we talked, the College of Cardinals, those who were entering the conclave had just entered the conclave, and we were speculating, and it's interesting because I went back and took a look at things. One of the guys that you did in fact bring up was one Bob Prevost from originally from Chicago, who wound up getting the nod on the second day. And so props to you for that. That was well done. You seem to have your nose on things there. But look, I mean, so it happened pretty quickly. And before I get to where you are right now, I kind of want to sort of put you back in that headspace. I mean, what was it like? You were there, I think you showed me a picture.
I was there. I'm glad you asked me that because it was a thrill to actually be there for a lot of reasons. But it's funny, we were all expecting this to be a long conclave, and the first three smokes were all black. And then I was with a deacon friend of mine from the North American College. We were in the square, and there was no 4:30 smoke in the afternoon. And that was expected. They said, there's no pope, there won't be any smoke till like 6 or 7. So we left the square and went to a little bar that was right next to the Vatican. And I was sitting there belting down Negronis, feeling no pain, thinking, well, it's going to be another black smoke night.
Right.
And then we look at our watch and we said, we better get back to the square just in case there's white smoke. But by then the line to get back in was huge.
Okay.
But we gradually work our right before we go through security. We hear the crowds just roaring with joy. And so, oh gosh, there's white smoke. Sure enough, we get in, there's white smoke and the bells are ringing. I was able to work my way right down towards where the obelisk is right there.
Okay, yeah, I know where it is. Yeah.
You can't get right near the obelisk because the Vatican has turned everything into a stockyard of barricades.
Right.
For whatever reason. It's crazy. But I stood there and it was just, I was expecting it to be Cardinal Parolin because it was a fast conclave.
Right.
And that was the wisdom that everybody was, all the pun, if it's a fast conclave, it's Parolin, it's Parolin, it's Parolin. So when they came out and, Cardinalum Prevost, I just about dropped over because he was one of the guys that I had heard was surging at the end, but I still thought they're not going to elect an American. I don't care how attenuated his Americanism might be by dual citizenship in Peru. He's still an American.
I mean, it really is crazy. Yeah, I mean, he's Bob from Chicago. I mean, like, that is just so never in my wildest dreams would I have thought that a Bob from Chicago would be sitting on the chair of Peter. I mean, it really is, and for me, like, that is a kind of thing that'll, I think, continue to unfold with things. So I want to come clean. When I so same thing, right? I'm here, and I was in class, and somebody grabbed me and said, Cale, we've got white smoke, and I'm like, oh, okay, okay, like, that's not good. I was not happy. Just
me either.
Blunt, not happy because I thought, like everybody else, that meant Parolin was able to shore up enough votes and sort of make a quick conclave, and I was pretty bummed about that. And maybe later on we can talk about why I was bummed about that. But then, so I go into the classroom, and the weight is quite quite something. It's a solid, I don't know, felt like 45 minutes, maybe more. And so I was, but I'm teaching class at this point. So I had my computer on and had a little window up, on the top of my computer, so that in the event that the curtains would break. So sure enough, it happened, and so all of my students. So I'm playing it now for my students. I'm projecting it up onto the screen, and we're just kind of waiting, and you can sort of see it. And I just have to say, just as a phenomenon, it's just kind of amazing. Because my kids are teenagers. Like, they're like, okay, like, cool, I guess, but they're not watching it the way that you and I are watching, But anyway, so it happens, and he comes out, and it's Prevost, and and I was like, oh man, and what it set me off, I'll tell you this, and this is this is sort of in the spirit of confession. What really set me off is that I saw a couple of my favorite, not so favorite American Cardinals just grinning ear to ear, and I was like, oh man, they got their guy, and that's really sort of where my headspace was, and I'm not necessarily proud of it, but I'm just, again, in the spirit of being honest, I was like, oh man, those son of a guns, they got their guy.
It was kind of annoying seeing that prissy Cardinal world grinning from ear to ear.
Or like, Supich or Tobin. I was just like, oh, come on,
But still, my initial reaction also was one of kind of disappointment, not despair. Despair would have been had they elected, some uber liberal. If they had announced the name of Holderich or Supich or something, I think I would have slit my wrist. But Prevost, I thought, well, okay, kind of like Parolin. He's a guy I could live with, but I felt kind of bleh. I just felt like, because I was hoping for a Pizzaballa or an Erdo or a Cardinal Ike of the Netherlands. By the way, last time I said Ike was from Sweden. He's from the Netherlands. A viewer wrote to me and said, you made a mistake there.
Get your facts straight, chap. Come on.
Yeah, absolutely. And at any rate, so I was like, okay, it's not a real exciting. And there was this Filipino nun, little diminutive woman, jumping up when they announced Prevost. She was jumping up and down, and tears were streaming, and she was waving a little Vatican flag. And I figured she must know. So I turned to her because she spoke English. And I said, oh, I guess you know something about Cardinal Prevost. Tell me about Cardinal Prevost. And she goes, who? So what struck me at that moment was, to a certain extent, I was overthinking this, that the great beauty of what was transpiring before me for the average Catholic standing in the square was that it didn't matter to them who the new pope. She didn't even know who Prevost was.
It's so interesting because so you're in Rome, you're running into little Filipino nuns. I'm in America, and I've got a classroom filled with American kids, and it was so funny to hear them, and I'm a mature adult, so I'm like keeping, I'm not gonna blame anybody or anything like that. But I said, well, we'll see. I mean, like, really interesting. And then he comes out in the Mozada. Is that how you say that?
Yeah, I think so.
The full, the whole getup, right? And so my eyebrow went up. I was like, oh, well, that's cool, right? Because
deliberate.
Well, right. So for the sake of the audience, when Francis came out 12 and a half years ago, he famously came out in all white. And he was not wearing anything except the all whites. He did not wear the sort of the getup. And if you see, photos of this moment for the papacy's going back quite a ways, you see that it was a deliberate decision on the part of Francis to sort of not come out with what so then my students were like, man, check out that drip. It goes hard. Like they just thought it was like he looked cool. Right.
Well, he did look cool. And Francis's first words were Buena Sera, good evening. And the first words of Prevost, of Leo, were Pace.
Right. Peace. Yeah.
Peace.
And so, well, I was going to ask you, so I remember not making too much of it when Francis came out 12 and a half years ago, what have you. It just didn't quite register. But but to see that choice made gave me a little bit of a mental flinch. I'm like, oh, well, that's interesting. And then Pache, and I have to say this too, again, credit to my students. My students were like, they were looking, they were like, oh my gosh, he's adorable, Mr. Zelda, because he was kind of tearing up a little bit. And it was just amazing, the optics of it. I have been such a hardened, jerk on some level, right? That in that moment, my students just sort of open this thing up, like, his drip goes hard and he's adorable. Like, that's what my students said.
Yeah, and he is really, to me, he's going beyond my expectations. Like I said, at first I was like disappointed.
Well, hold that thought. Hold on. I want to get there. Okay. So then the third sort of part before we get into what has happened really in this week, because it's been a week, right? I mean, crazy. Yeah. But he comes out and as Anthony says in the comments, his name is Leo the 14th. Like, wait, what? So why? Okay, so again, for my audience's sake, why was I so surprised at Leo the 14th, Larry?
Well, it's because I think that people were expecting that it would be either John the 24th or a Paul the 7th or a Francis the 2nd name choice, something that evoked, in a sense, Vatican II and post-Vatican II pontificates to indicate continuity in the hermeneutical retrieval of the council, blah, 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 blah.
Right. No, but that's real. Right?
Leo the 14th is interesting because it indicates, number one, that this Pope has a certain savvy about him, understanding that his biggest role and task as Pope is to reunify a divided church, to bring peace to a church in turmoil. And to choose a papal name like John or Paul or Francis II would inherently freight his papacy from the get-go with certain political overtones and connotations. Whereas to go way back into the late 19th century, early 20th, and choose Leo, the father of modern social teaching, who at the same time re-energized Thomism. Right. To me, it's a stroke of genius on his part.
Yeah.
So I think what it indicates is that he's going to be a pope that's not going to focus on changing church doctrines, or even like Francis seemed to do at times. He's going to be more focused on issues of practical, the corporal and spiritual works of mercy. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, so that night, admittedly, I'm a little bummed, but I'm kind of like, calm on myself. And I think I sent you a Facebook message, something to the effect of like, oh man, I'm feeling a little nervous, but I'm kind of calming myself down. And then I saw you the next day. You had said something to the effect of, I went to bed last night and I woke up thinking about Leo and I feel pretty good. Do you remember you said something like that?
Yeah, I did. I wrote it to you.
Yeah.
I got to say this too. Thank God that the cellular data to your cell phone was pretty jammed up when I was in the square. There, easily were 100,000, 150,000 people there. And you literally could not get any data reception, phone reception, or any. And that is such a blessing.
It's a blessing.
I would have immediately started tweeting, "What the hell is this garbage?" Great, a Francis II. I would have probably said things that I regretted.
Yeah.
So I did text you later on.
Yeah, and I even, the next day, I woke up feeling kind of like, all right, and this sort of thing. So we'll get into the week here in just a second. And I tweeted out, said, look, I saw the wrong, quote unquote, the wrong people smiling, and I overreacted, and I probably posted in haste, Habemus Papam, whatever. There it is. So, all right. So, okay. So let's talk about this week, Larry, because I got to tell you, if you would have told me that I would feel this way this week. If you would have told me that a week ago or 2 weeks ago or a month ago or a year ago, I would not have believed you. Not that there couldn't have been a pope who would sort of do maybe something a little bit different, but that it would so radically change my frame of mind and my frame of heart. Does that resonate at all with you?
But I agree. What it is, I've been thinking a lot about this. It's just confirmation of the old adage, addition by subtraction.
Okay.
That we have, I think none of us have even begun to scratch the surface of the depth of demoralization that had set in upon us. This is a real phenomenon. This is not histrionics.
Right.
Over the past 12 years. And I'm not talking about rad trad types or anything like that. I'm talking about
I am, Larry, but you go ahead. I'm kidding.
Yeah, I mean, I'm talking about ordinary,
right,
just conservative Catholics like me, not even a trad, just demoralized, beaten down. I mean, I get tons of emails every month from people all over the world who follow my podcast and blog. And this isn't bragging, it's just to make a point, who say, I'm really having a little bit of a problem. I just don't feel it. I'm just not feeling in the Catholic zone. I'm demoralized. And now all of a sudden, overnight, boom, it's like a huge boulder has been lifted off of our shoulders. And it is because I truly believe Pope Francis was a bad pope. And I know there are going to be those who, you shouldn't say that, or I disagree with you, or what do you mean by that? I think he was a bad pope. I think he demoralized the church's base, and that's not a pope's job to do, and I think that Prevost comes out, and at first on paper, I didn't know who he was that much. I thought, okay, but he's got a presence about him that's inspiring, that's uplifting. And now all of a sudden I feel a bounce back in my step and saying, you know what, this might turn out really, really good.
Yeah. So again, very similar. I think I had underappreciated my own. I think I had underappreciated my own demoralization, like genuinely. And just personally, Larry, you were very helpful for me. If I'm looking back on it and being honest, I think there were a couple of times where I was just so fed up, so disgusted that I didn't know what to do with it other than, and then I remember we were doing one of our shows. This is like 4 or 5 years ago. And you said, Cale, he's just a bad pope. And I sort of blinked a little bit, and and this is someone who we have talked about sort of coming off our ultramontane tendencies, especially after John Paul II and Benedict XVI, and I wasn't really fully cognizant of what that meant to me. And then finally you just said, Cale, he's a bad pope. That happens. And it didn't make the bad taste go away, mind you, but at least it gave me a kind of a little bit of breathing room, rather than sort of be tempted to just sort of say, the heck with it all, I'm out. That's now what his, again, this is me speaking, this is not Larry. What his badness says about the nature of the papacy is a conversation that I do think we're going to have. But really what I want to focus on here, Larry, is just that the fact that underrating how much oppression that felt like, kind of heaviness of heart and a kind of heaviness of it. I had underrated how much it embittered me.
Yeah, me too. When I said, to you 4 years ago, hey, look, he's just a bad pope, it may have come across as well, Larry seems to be coping with this quite well, and that's why. Actually, I mean, that was a mantra that I just would say to myself in prayer over and over. It's just a bad pope. It's just a bad pope. Right. This too shall pass. This too shall pass.
Yeah.
And it did help me. It helped me greatly to put it in perspective. All that being said, I think you're right. We have to have a conversation now about what does this mean with regard to the papacy, our theology of the papacy. Well, I think it doesn't change it too much, but what it does is it it puts the papacy back in perspective as simply what it should be is the Pope should be more umpire than pitcher.
Yeah.
You're right.
Yeah.
That he's a court of last resort. So as I say it in a pillar column, I said, what I want is a non-activist Pope. Wouldn't it be great if we had a Pope that Pope Leo never wrote an encyclical, never issued a motu proprio, who just was in Rome to be the court of last appeal, who made public statements and so on, maybe traveled around the world, but didn't try to, in a sense, alter anything theologically in the church. How refreshing would that be?
Well, yeah, that's an interesting thought experiment, and I admit I've kind of played around with that idea in my head a little bit, but for me the ironies abound, because for an entire dozen years or so, we were, despite all the work, we need a church that doesn't look internally, that it looks out. But the irony is that that's exactly what we were doing as a church. We were navel gazing in the worst kind of ways, meanwhile leaving the world completely unchallenged, evangelized, unwitnessed to, in a really kind of sad way. No, I know I'm speaking in broad generalities here.
See, the thing is, I think the situation was even worse than that, in the sense that the reason why we were navel gazing rather than reaching out to evangelize the world is precisely because we wanted to change church teaching in order to import that world into the church. In other words, the navel gazing had an agenda. It had a point. I mean, just look at the stacked deck of the Synod on Synodality and who gets invited. Cardinal Hollerich made the Relator General, and he's a public dissenter on LGBTQ issues. James Martin is invited as a voting member of the Synod, but not the president priest of Courage International. I mean, the deck was stacked with an agenda. And so so in a sense, there was an outwardness to it, but it was a bad outwardness. It was an accommodationist outwardness. And all of the inwardness was just kind of fake. It was all curated, and it was just a stalking horse for other things. I'm convinced of that. And to that end, and I'll say this and I'll let you talk, not only was Francis a bad pope, but I think a certain case can be made from a certain perspective that he might have been the worst pope in history, because other bad popes were bad in terms of having garden variety vices like greed and lust and power madness. And so their badness came in. This pope had a bunch of kids. This pope had a bunch of mistresses. This pope had a bunch of gay lovers. This pope raided the treasury. This pope made all kinds
classic depravity, if you will. Yeah,
exactly. You get the point. Whereas Pope Francis had none of those vices. Obviously, he was a man of Christian virtue in that regard, but he was something else. He was a pope who decided to change fundamental church doctrines, not overtly, but covertly. Through a process of slow corrosion, slow drift, and that was very clear. I mean, it's very, very clear what direction he wanted to take the church. And therefore, that's unique in the history of the papacy.
It is.
A pope who actively tried to alter fundamental church teaching in morals, in moral theology. I don't think we've ever witnessed that before.
Well, and I think for people like me, this is what was so confusing, right? And it's confusing because up until 12 and a half years ago, it was made abundantly clear to me as an educated layman who actively practiced his faith that, this is, it means these things. And we want you to do these things. And we want you to sort of worship and, worship. And we wanted you to sort of, and then all of a sudden, through having done nothing, like I didn't throw a pitch, I didn't all of a sudden I became bad guy. I became rigid guy. I became, a psychologically disturbed guy. I became, Right. I was an indietrist. I was impious. I was impious. You know, I was all of these things like overnight. And, you know, no, that's not the way you do things. That's not, you know, when I read my way back into the church after a petulant, you know, I'm out of here at the age of 16 or whatever it was, right? You know, when I read my way back into the church, I read my way back into the church, and then I practiced my way back into the church, you know, with a sense of heroism and a robustness of call, and the sense that this was meaningful and significant and enduring, right? That this is not, I'm not hitching my wagon to, you know, the latest, greatest model, you know, T. No, I was hitching my wagon to something that had kind of withstood the ravages of modernity. And now all of a sudden, because I had withstood the ravages of modernity, I'm now suddenly being put out into the pasture. And I, you know, I'm still, you can tell I'm still kind of mad about it.
Well, that's just the point that I made earlier about how we've, you know, I don't think we've understood quite yet fully the PTSD we all have now, because and poor Pope Leo has to deal with our PTSD. The fact that for 12 years we were under the rule of an abusive father, and that's what it was. A father who publicly would say todos, everyone, perhesia, open conversation, inclusion, dialogue, all the while taking millions of Catholics like you and me and others and saying, you're not part of the todos.
Right.
I not only don't include you in that, I don't like you, and I would like you to leave.
So okay,
and that's extremely demoralizing when you go from having a pope that you felt was on your side and energized you, that the center held, right? The center held. The peripheries might be going mad, but the center was holding. Now the center's not holding, the peripheries are going mad, and you're on the outs. And that was a terrible feeling.
It was awful, truly. But, you know, I tell you, so in that next 24 and then 48 hours, you know, my wife was asking me like what I felt. And it's like, you know, honey, I just feel like, and we'll talk about some of these gestures, because I think it's an interesting comparison between the gestures of a dozen years ago and the gestures that we have that are making people like you and I be like, man, can I relax now? You know, I felt like I had a dad who loved me, you know, and wouldn't mind having a beer with me.
Yes. I think that the key to understanding Pope Leo and appreciating him is to lower expectations in one sense and realize, no, he's not going to make the old Latin liturgy the standard rite of the church again. He's probably not going to suppress the Novus Ordo. He's not going to, you know, make these aggressive conservative moves. We're going to have to sort of realize, okay, he's not a trad pope. He's not Pius XIII. On the other hand, he's not that. He's also not. He's not an. It always seemed to me that Pope Francis went out of his way if he ran across a bear in the woods to grab a stick and poke it in the eye. And I just don't get a sense that Pope Leo is put a stick in the bear's eye kind of guy. I think he's the opposite. I think he's a guy who actually cares about people with whom he might disagree. He cares about unity in the church. He actually likes people. And I think, therefore, he's going to go out of his way to do things to heal those divisions. So I'm with you. I feel like now, even if this Pope makes some decisions I don't completely agree with, I'm going to be far more inclined to say, fine, he's the Pope, because I will have a sense that he actually cares about his flock.
You know, it's one of those adages. When I was the dean of faculty, we used to say, you know, I used to preach to my teachers, especially my new hires. I said, look, you know, we're at a Catholic school, and so we can sort of use this language overtly. But I said, you know, kids learn when they feel loved and seen by you as the adult in the room. And I said it then because I believed it then, and I believe it even more now. You know, there's just a tremendous amount of space clearing and opening up and leavening that occurs when dad loves you, right? I mean, and again, as I tweeted similar things, I said, look, invariably there's going to be something that he does that I might raise an eyebrow over. I'll be like, oh, I don't really like this, or maybe I wish he would go faster, or maybe I wish he would go slower, and all that kind of stuff, right? I mean, that's all going to be in play. And like you, I don't think he's some crypto trad or anything like that. Yeah. But I do think he understands that the church is divided in a way that is perilous, and that there's for no reason. Like what juice do you get out of that squeeze is sort of my question. Yeah. And so what did you see him do the first 24 hours, 48 hours, Larry?
Well, well, the first thing, is he came out in full papal garb.
Yeah.
The second thing is that in his talk from the loggia, it was just riddled with references to Jesus Christ, the path to salvation, and the hope and peace that he brings to the world. There was no attenuation of that message.
Right,
in other words,
right.
to like, oh, let's all be nice and nice, and then after that, immediately, he, in his talks to fellow cardinals, his talks to the diplomatic corps. All right, he's constantly going out of his way to emphasize this need for ecclesial unity, constantly emphasizing the living out of the gospel. This is key. This man was a missionary in Peru.
Right.
I think he understands that the core of the Christian life involves living out the evangelical counsels, doing the corporal and spiritual works of mercy, and that gives me hope. But I also think that two significant things have happened in this past week as well. One was, he met with the Eastern Rite Catholics the other day in St. Peter's.
Yeah. I know.
A lot of Ukrainians were there.
Yeah.
My friend Louis Ayres tried to go to mass. I said it was a zoo, an absolute zoo. And well, that's because they've turned St. Peter's in. It's
a different stream, but yes, it's awful. Keep going.
So in his talk to the Eastern Rite Catholics, he talked about how necessary it was for the West to, in a sense, pay attention to the wisdom of the East, liturgically speaking, and the need for the Church of the West to restore a sense of transcendence and mystagogy. You saw the quote, right, Cale?
Yeah, please, yeah.
I love it. So you know what I'm talking about. There was not a sense of fakery about it. He seemed to mean it.
Yeah,
that gives me hope that he might restore. True synodalism would allow for liturgical pluralism, right?
Right.
So that was the great performative contradiction at the heart of the Francis papacy. He talked about synodalism, synodal church, all the while he was smashing down anybody he disagreed with through motu proprios. What better expression of a synodal church? And this is the other significant thing, is that he kept mentioning Pope Leo. He wanted to continue on developing a synodal church, but he always added collegiality.
Right.
With a collegial oneness with the world's bishops, which is hearkening then to the teaching of Vatican II, and embedding synodality within collegiality, which is exactly what I've been saying for 2 years in all my articles. Vatican II did not talk about synodality, it talked about collegiality. And I think you're going to see under Pope Leo an emphasis on synodality, but synodality as it should be practiced. Yeah. And that is going to include a genuine pluralism in the church. And I would hope that it would include liturgical pluralism. Therefore, it would mean a kind of rest. I don't think he's just going to repress Traditionis Custodes. I think that would be considered a slap in the face of Francis. But I think he's going to so modify it that I think traditionalists will be happy with it, and that will bring.
Well, I think and I think the easiest move for that is just sort of take. There was that one component to TC in particular that I thought was pretty disgusting, which was any requests to say that the TLM went through Rome as opposed to the local ordinary, as opposed to the local bishop, which is just a shocking rebuke of a bunch of things, not least of which is the Second Vatican Council. But ironies again continue to abound. So I think that if that, all he would have to do is say, look, it's these kind of liturgical decisions I kick back to the local bishops, I think they would go a long, long way. I don't know. We'll see. I mean,
Well, the document that the Vatican put out about implementing Traditionis Custodes went so far as to tell local parishes what they could or could not put in the parish bulletin.
The bulletin, Larry.
Mass times they couldn't advertise TLM masses in the parish bulletin. And I remember thinking, how non-synodal, how top-down papal centralist is that Rome is now micromanaging what in the hell a parish can put in its bulletin.
Meanwhile, Larry, it can't pass a basic audit, but whatever. What do I know? I'm just a dumb
pride
layman.
Masses with priests wearing rainbow stoles and rainbow chasubles and the altar cloth being rainbow, all right, that's okay. That you can advertise that to the moon and back.
Right.
And that's what was so demoralizing. You're not going to see that under Pope Leo. This is my prediction. Now, all that being said, another significant thing happened this week, talking about the first week of the papacy, that indicates that there is going to be continuity with Vatican II. I don't care what Bishop Athanasius Schneider wants, because he's crazy anyway. All right. I do believe he's nuts. But I need to.
You're good. I don't care. Go ahead.
I reviewed his book Credo. I reviewed his book Flee from Heresy and Catholic Religion, but they're both deeply flawed books. They might have just be called Why I Hate Vatican II and every pope since then, and what I would do if I were pope. And one of the first things he would do is get rid of religious freedom, get rid of interreligious dialogue. He considers all non-Christian religions in a scorched earth way as being just demonic deceptions, having no good in them at all, which argues for, actually he won't say it, but argues for a sense of total depravity, which is un-Catholic, because the Catholic Church does not teach total depravity, and therefore the general natural religion and religious sense of humanity in general has some good in it. As C.S. Lewis says, God gets his life into us sometimes through what he calls good dreams. And by good dreams, Lewis meant the mythopoesis of the world, which has errors in it, and the church has to purge those errors. But nevertheless, there's goodness there. So in the past week, Pope Francis sent a very short letter to the Jewish community here in Rome and to the American Jews saying, I fully adhere to the teaching of Nostra Aetate and Vatican II, and we are deeply committed to ongoing interreligious dialogue with our Jewish brothers and sisters. Likewise, 2 days ago, the Dicastery for Interreligious Dialogue, I can't think of the cardinal's name, George, Jacob, something or other, issued a statement on the in sort of letter to our Buddhist brothers and sisters when they were celebrating the feast of Vesta. Long story short, that letter too says we support Nostra Aetate. We support interreligious dialogue. I have an article coming out in the Pillar soon on this that I think will point out that this is in full continuity with Vatican II. And I think we're going to see more of the same from Pope Leo. So it's going to be I think what you're going to see from Pope Leo is a full and total commitment to all the standard themes of the Second Vatican Council.
It sounds very JP2 now that you say it out loud.
That's where I was headed. That it sounds like to me that we're looking at John Paul III more than a Francis II.
But he chooses Leo. And so what I wanted to talk to you, the second thing that I wanted to talk to you today is I wanted to talk a little bit about Rerum Novarum. And the reason why I want to talk to you about Rerum Novarum is that historically, that's such a fascinating document, right? When it comes out and its context. And I can't help but think that Leo is sniffing around this incoming cultural shift, cultural tsunami of AGI, artificial general intelligence. And I wonder what you think about what Rerum Novarum, on the new things. The new thing is AGI, is LLMs, it's ChatGPT, and more. Do you think that there is any kind of anything going on with that?
I think there's a huge connection there, especially since Pope Leo has specifically brought up AI on a couple of occasions. as part of the new cultural reality the church is going to have to deal with, just as Leo had to deal with, Pope Leo XIII had to deal with the new cultural realities of his time. So I don't think he's pointing at any specific content in Rerum Novarum and saying, I'm going to build on that content. Instead, based on his comments so far, I think rather that what he wants to build on is simply the paradigm, the model of engaging the world that Pope Leo's XIII's pontificate evinced overall, and Rerum Novarum being an example of that, which is you maintain your Catholic doctrinal orthodoxy and roots. I mean, Leo also energized Thomism in the church. You keep that, but you use that then as a foundation, not for being fortress Catholicism and isolated and looking at everything else as just an error factory. You use that to go out to the world to engage it, to take the spoils of Egypt, Christianize them, and turn them back to the world and say, this is what we propose to you. Now, you and I both saw that thing Rod Dreher posted, right? That YouTube video on AI.
Well, again, I'll be the guy who says this. I saw it, and within seconds, I shot Rod a text. I'm like, Rod, drop everything you're doing right now and watch this. I know you don't like to watch podcasts, Rod, but you got to watch this ASAP. And sure enough, I'm glad he saw what I saw, and he wrote a really great classic Dreher diary today. If you haven't seen it, guys, you should go on over to Substack. He's not paying me to say this, but go. It's a great piece. And of course, go watch Ross Douthat's interview of this fellow at AI 2027. I guarantee you it'll be a most challenging experience for you to watch what this guy has to say about AI.
Well, and it's interesting because I know that, Pope Leo Prevost is an educated man, and I'm sure he's been given briefings and so forth at the Vatican on the latest technological innovations. The thing that scared me the most about the young man, I can't think of his name.
Daniel, I'll get his name. Go ahead, talk.
I think he's spot on accurate about one thing. I had questions about some of what he was saying. For those listening, the basic thesis is by 2027, we might be looking at a robotic AI apocalypse where the human race is being threatened with extinction by robots that are the AI that is even now more intelligent than we think they are, that they're biding their time, hiding their own agenda, and then when the time comes, they're going to take over.
Right.
Now, that sounds like science fiction and I thought it was too, but he pointed out something that I think is so true, and it is this. The engine that is going to drive the AI revolution is the arms race between the United States, Russia, and China.
That's right.
Because at age 66, I'm old enough to remember the Cold War. I grew up under that whole fight between the Soviet Union and the United States. I'm the Vietnam era generation that was a proxy war for all that. So I know that a standard argument during that time was, well, we have to do this and we have to build these weapons because if we don't, the Russians will. Right. And that's exactly our thinking now with regard to AI. And I think this is so true. We're going to invest trillions in this AI technology, and we're going to build these AI industrial centers under the aegis of the Pentagon and dark ops and all that. Also, we get ahead of the Chinese.
If we're lucky, Larry, I mean, in other words, these companies are building these things whether we want them to or not. And at one point, the guy's name is Daniel Koketel. I put it in the chat if you want to see it, guys. And, he basically said, the government will, Washington will probably wake up relatively soon and just say, no, like we're taking this thing over. Right. But that's not how it's currently operating. What's currently happening is that these 6, 7, 8 tech CEOs are driving this bus. And you're precisely right that it's the fear of the Chinese getting there first that is both driving the speed of the research, but also driving the impetus, because we're going to want to get there first.
The tech giants are all about money, and what they see in the AI revolution is a world awash in wealth, trillions and trillions of dollars of new wealth, because we have all of these industrial products produced by AI robotics that you don't have to pay a penny towards. You get the idea. There's all kinds of profit. Right. But I think that we're naive if we think that there isn't already black ops, Pentagon operations going on, where this stuff is like we're building an army of intelligent soldier robots, monkey butlers, robot butlers, the whole sort of thing.
So the reason why I invoke rerum novarum is that historically you have a similar-ish situation in which you have the Industrial Revolution really kind of hyper driving the formation of the modern nation state. And so when you read rerum novarum, you really see the fear there is that these nation states are going to gobble up people, right? They're going to be now interestingly enough, that in the kind of creative destruction of that wave of the economic expansion is that your job might be eaten up, but then in essence it opens up a couple of other jobs that then you can kind of slot in. And so with bumps and bruises along the way, it kind of evens its way out. What I found particularly disturbing about Cockatel's narrative is that it's just going to eat up all of the jobs.
Yeah, all of them. And the other disturbing thing was that he's predicting that these AI robots will attempt to kill all of us.
Right.
There's just so much wasted resource, that we're in the way. We're just like a bug that they need to step on.
Right. But, and so the profound. Go ahead. Yeah.
I was going to say Ross Delta though asked, I think,
the best question. Yeah.
The best questions at the end, where obviously everything that this guy was saying, it clearly implied that he thought that the AIs are somehow conscious. He just sort of dismissed the question of consciousness. Well, if that's what you mean by consciousness,
then they're
conscious. And yet everything he's saying is, these things are known to lie to people. They have their own agenda. They're just biding their time. And when the time comes, blah, blah, blah. I'm sorry, you're talking in the language of intentionality.
Right.
You're talking in the language of self-aware consciousness.
Yeah.
Now, the only way that that's possible, and Ross brought this out, is if you subscribe to a theory of the emergence of consciousness as this emergent property. In other words, that as soon as you reach a level of neurological complexity, either organic or synthetic, once you reach a certain level of complexity, then automatically consciousness sort of emerges as a byproduct of that complexity.
Right.
Now, that theory is very popular in some circles because it answers problems, supposedly, that a more reductive theory of mind cannot. But, materialistically reductive.
Yep.
Nevertheless, to me, the language of emergence is this faux mystical language. It is bogus language. It is buzzword language. It's one of those words that sounds good, but when you unpack it, it has no meaning. And what do you mean by emergence? Well, I mean that when it reaches a certain level of complexity, consciousness just sort of, emerges.
Right.
Well, how? How it, I don't know, emerges. Right. It doesn't explain anything. And therefore, I don't think AIs are conscious because I don't subscribe to an emergence theory of consciousness. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but I don't. And because I don't think they're conscious, this is precisely why they're actually more dangerous. And Ross asked the proper question. You would think if they're conscious, they would have developed some sense of morality, some sense of, empathy for other conscious beings.
Value.
The fact that this guy is predicting that they're just going to wipe us all out would indicate a level of just sheer, we don't care. Just efficiency. Like that getting rid of us is simply part of an algorithmic conclusion of some kind. Is my point.
Yeah, I of course take this into like a sort of a hyper woo space, because I think these things are designed, and I suspect that something is operating in what we call the black box of AGI, and that they're being summoned. I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, I think I can agree with that. And I don't think they're conscious, but I do believe that they are super sophisticated.
Oh, yeah.
Unbelievably grand computers capable of doing 1 trillion calculations a nanosecond or something, but are not conscious and therefore are not moral, and therefore could have things easily programmed into them that are malevolent by malevolent people. Let's just put it that way.
Correct. And so Ross asks, I think, the great question. He says, these some of the most important questions, which is, what are we for, right? And it was really remarkable to me that Daniel had no answer for that at all. And in fact, in this strange moment, he kind of kicks the question back at Ross and says, well, what do you think? What do you think the purpose?
And Ross said, wait a minute, I'm not the one coming up with the prediction here. You are.
Right. And he says, I have a religious answer to it, which is exactly correct, right? And so these folks, even the ones who are scared about it, have just zero kind of philosophical or anthropological depth when it comes to these questions.
And this is precisely why Pope Leo wants to talk about this, because I think he looks out into this landscape, to bring it back to our conversation about Pope Leo, and to realize the Catholic intellectual tradition has more to offer this conversation than any other intellectual tradition in the world. That science remains utterly materialistically reductive in its endpoint, regardless of whether you call it emergence. I don't care what you want to call it. By the way, one of the reasons why I don't believe in reductive senses. Roger Sperry did the famous split brain research. I used to do science and religion stuff. He did split brain research. People sometimes with severe epilepsy, really, really bad epilepsy, have surgery to actually have the two hemispheres of their brain separated. There you go. All right. And in split brain research, when you separate the two sides of the brain, a reductive theory of mind to brain should say, well, now there's two people in there. Right. Now there's two consciousness working. There isn't. There's still a single person in there. And that led Roger Sperry to say, there's something going on here. And then theories of emergence and panpsychism and all this sort of stuff emerge out of that. But nevertheless, it's incoherent, and therefore the Catholic, hylomorphic theory, Catholic concepts of, and this is where Thomism can be extreme, a Thomistic psychology and epistemology, I think, can be very, very, very helpful in this regard.
Right, and so I'm really excited, frankly, that, these challenges to us, these existential challenges to us, are right in the wheelhouse of our faith. Right, it's right in the wheelhouse, that the church can speak profoundly about, the Imago Dei, and all of this language of accompaniment and all this language of dialogue. That's all great if you understand that specifically in the context of human dignity and human worth. And it seems to me that in this moment, this is precisely the time in which the world has no vocabulary for value beyond material or economic, right?
This is key. That even if we can't get the world perhaps to completely sign on to the Catholic vision, we can provide the conversation with a vocabulary that makes the lines of distinction clearer as to exactly. One of the things when I was listening to the interview, I just kept thinking that the Daniel didn't understand the terms of the debate. I just had the sense that he gets the danger that AI poses, but he does not completely understand consciousness, more, any of that kind of stuff.
No.
That is really not simply a sidebar conversation. It's central to the conversation, and he didn't seem to want to have that conversation.
Right. And I have to just add, I have to add this into the conversation that we're having, Larry, that, a month ago, I'm teaching Frankenstein, right? And the book hinges on, this runaway experimentation to see if you can do a thing. And at no point did Victor, the young, aspiring doctor, mad scientist, at no point does he stop to ask the question, like, what am I doing? And what am I doing this for? And what are the implications of achieving this thing that I think I can do? At no point does he ask those very real and from my perspective, of course, obvious questions to ask. And that book's from 1818. This is not a new book, and it is posing the exact questions that our big tech overlords have not been exposed to. And my concern about that is that I actually think they're going to be able to achieve what they want to achieve. Like I think that's real enough, right? Arguments about consciousness is, what exactly this is. It doesn't matter on some level because it'll pass as consciousness. It will pass as agency. It will pass as all of these things. And I don't sense that we are living in a world that is ready for this.
I think that the question of consciousness, I agree with you, by the way. The practical effect is not going to be affected by, whether or not the thing is conscious or not. It's going to act as if it is conscious, right. And therefore the average person will simply assume it to be so. Nevertheless, I think then, though, thinking people will ask the question, is it really conscious? And there will be implications to how we answer that question. And I think the church's contribution will be hopefully a determinative one in that regard, because I do believe that the emergence of AI, if people come to believe that it is conscious on the grounds that it acts as if it is, I think it will destroy the faith of millions.
I agree. Can you? I know we're running up here on time, but I would like you to unpack that a little bit more. Why do you think that the experience of an artificial general intelligence that is conscious, again, whether that's passes the test or whatever, but how will that felt experience affect people? Why do you think that this will?
Well, because I think the way that it will get spun in the media, by the scientific establishment and so on, is that consciousness, really is simply the excrement of the brain. That your brain exudes thoughts like your liver exudes bile. And the fact that we can now build conscious beings on our own is proof that consciousness is not spiritual. It's not immaterial.
Right.
There's nothing special about us whatsoever. We could replicate this over and over and over and so on.
So therefore, fill in the blank for me.
Well, therefore, we don't have a soul. Therefore, there's no God. Therefore, when you die, that's it. The worms get you. And so you better hope that someday we can figure out how to download your consciousness into a machine so that it lives on forever and ever, which, of course, is crazy, because there's no way that once again, a level of philosophical unsophistication. You can't transfer subjective feelings to a chip and then say, well, that's me. No, it's the imitation of me. It wouldn't be me experiencing those things. It's not my immortality in a subjective personal sense. It's that I built a machine that has all of my memories in it in an imitative, in a mimetic way. But it's not me.
Right. And I think what frustrates me about folks who do take this seriously on some level, or take questions of philosophy and theology and anthropology and psychology seriously, is that there's this strange move that they do where they say something to the effect of like, oh, it's not real, don't worry about it. Or, oh, it's just an illusion, it's not really conscious, or whatever it is. And my frustrations with that is that you have kind of answered your own intellectual concerns, but you're failing to take into account what this will generate amongst the rest of us.
That's right.
You know, it's
right.
like you get hung up on the technicality.
Well, go back to the old Star Trek show, Next Generation, with Data,
yeah.
Who is a cyborg, a robot, whatever you want to call it. He looks like a human and so forth. If you're a veteran viewer of that show, over time, you start to think of Data as just another human being on the bridge. He's just faster and better at math and stuff.
Right.
Okay. There's even one episode of Star Trek where they're threatening to disassemble Data. Right. And Picard comes to his defense saying, no, he's a person. He has rights and so on. And I think eventually that's exactly how we will come to view AI robots that act and look. I mean, they're going to make robots that look like human beings. I mean, as it gets more and more and more sophisticated, you're going to see robots walking down the street that look like Tom Cruise. It's going to be, and so it's going to be really hard for us to avoid exactly what you're talking about, the effect of all of this on all of us. As well, they're conscious because they're acting conscious.
Is there anything in Rerum Novarum that you point to, look to, get inspiration from, that speaks to you in this moment?
Well, it's just that if you read Rerum Novarum, it's interesting that Pope Leo XIII doesn't offer any very specific prescriptive proposals. This is what society needs to hear. It's what it needs to hear.
Right.
In the end, as he analyzes the rights of labor versus the rights of management and so on, he reaches the conclusion that the answer to most of our social problems, if not all of them, is that we need to live the Christian virtues. That if management and ownership of industry lives Christian virtues, then they won't act like jerks towards their employees. And if labor lives a life of Christian virtue, then they won't, in a sense, have a sense of entitlement to riches and wealth, and an envy, a class envy, and therefore class struggle, and all the things that the right feared about labor unions as closeted commies. And so he's saying, look, we just need a society grounded in Christian virtue. So I think that I'm not certain how that translates into this debate about AI, that if we just lived lives of Christian virtue, other than the fact that only a society that doesn't have Christian virtue would build these damn things in the first place.
Right.
That would develop trillion-dollar tech industries who are completely amoral and only care about profit margins and, to a certain extent, social engineering and social control. So in some sense, it's too late. Barring some revolution of the spirit in which the captains of industry and governmental leaders and so on wake up and realize that a life of Christian virtue demands a level of ascesis. That means we shouldn't do these things because of the harm and damage that they bring. I don't think that's going to happen, and therefore I think we're screwed. I think it's too late. I think that a certain apocalypse is upon us. So I'm not certain what insights Rerum Novarum can give us, to be honest with you.
Yeah, and as I think about it, I'm looking at a group of kids who graduate in 9 days. I've been teaching them all year long, and they're all headed to college, and I don't know what to tell them, to be blunt. They're all looking at going, if you look at the sticker price, you're talking anywhere between $75,000 and $95,000 a year.
Yeah.
For a degree that they're all have been tacitly encouraged should be practical, right? That you need to be concerned about ROI, return on investment, those sorts of things. And it looks like, when you watch a show like the Doubt Show, it's like, well, most jobs will be fine for 18 months or so. It's like, what exactly are we sending our kids into? And so then, of course, the conversation always tacks immediately to UBI, universal basic income. And I think to myself, in part, I'm like, well, that would be nice, right? But then I also think that we've just lived through a decade in which deaths from despair have skyrocketed, right? Deaths from despair are real, Larry, right? And deaths from despair come from your felt sense that you're just not worth it. And if we are steering right into a storm in which no one will work anymore, again, these are all like what ifs and what ifs and what ifs, right? I'm really concerned about the truth that UBI is just not enough for us human beings.
I agree. I mean, as somebody, I'm a Catholic worker.
Right.
You know, I liquidated my pension when I left DeSales University in order to buy the farm.
Yeah.
So I don't have a pension. I do get Social Security in the mail. You know, I'm thinking, you know, in other words, I live voluntary poverty. My wife has a job, and you know, we be Poe, and I'm telling you, so UBI has an inbuilt instinctive appeal to me as well. Like, wow,
right,
that'd be really great, eh? I wouldn't have to do nothing except sit on my typewriter and do nothing.
Right,
you know,
nothing.
Yeah, you know, but in reality, what would probably happen is I would probably just say, well, that's great. Let me get some potato chips and surf the internet and maybe a nice bourbon and a cigar. And, you know, all of us, one of the problems with all of that kind of, so it sounds utopianistic. We'd have all this leisure time, and that would be great. But the deeper question is, without answering what are people for, then what do we do with our leisure time?
Right.
If you have leisure and you build something out of that leisure, all the better. But when you combine that with an AI culture, a digital culture, what you would have is a society of lazy, fat porn addicts. That's what you would have.
Right.
All right. Or gaming addicts of some kind. And the dissipation and you talk about despair.
Right. Ugh. And that's what I'm getting at, right? And so, you know, so really what you're looking at, I happen to be reading the chapter in Matthew Crawford's book, World Beyond Your Head, in which he talks about the model of the casino as the kind of architected space in which we will find ourselves. And he's not talking about this specifically, but that's sort of hovering in the background of my imagination as I'm watching this stuff about Ross and AGI and all of it. And I just think to myself, we're just going to plug ourselves into the casino, the capital T, capital C casino, and just tap to it's called you play to depletion. And I'm just really concerned that we're going to just play to depletion.
You have no idea how horrifying that is to me.
Oh, dude.
I've only been in a casino once in my life. And it was about 25 years ago. It was in Bally's Casino in Atlantic City. And I only went down there because my mother was visiting and she likes casinos.
Yeah, of course.
And so I took my mother, and it was the only time I'd been. And as soon as I stepped in the door, there was a sensory overload of bing, 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 and lights, and bing, 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 all this noise. And I seriously got sick to my stomach. I had a visceral disgust well up within me. And I'd like to think that it was something spiritual or righteous. No, there was just something profoundly unhuman about it that put me, and I never set foot in a casino again. So your analogy is a great one, because I fear that if we're all headed towards that model, we're in deep kimchi.
Well, amen. You know, and so, you know, again, it's one of those things you could almost excuse it for old people. And again, not that I recommended it, but it's like, but what do you tell kids? I mean, honestly, like, what do you tell a 17-year-old kid? Now, you know what? College, work, like it doesn't lead to human flourishing. I'm just convinced that it is a recipe for human extinction. And
It is.
Nobody seems to care about that. I don't get it.
That's why I think we're kind of screwed, because what's really required is a revolution that begins when our children are still children. One of the crises that universities face is precisely that they don't know what they're for anymore, other than the production of jobs where people can get money. And so the idea that it's a university has been lost. And the reason why it's been lost is because our educational system up to that point, isn't it? In an ideal world, university education would be reserved to people who simply want a professional degree of something or other. And that young people will have learned how to read the classics, would have learned the humanities, would have learned a foreign language, how to play a musical instrument, how to read Shakespeare, from the moment they're in kindergarten until the moment they graduate high school, and therefore are capable of a certain being autodidacts for the rest of their life. And therefore you encourage them to read books, to have a library in their home. You probably run into this too. Once in a while, I have a neighbor visit our house or somebody, and they're not academic, and they look around, and number one, they see we don't have a television set. And number two, that every wall is covered with books, and they find that astounding, somewhat attractive, but also weird and bizarre. But I mean, you go back in time, and homes had libraries. The more expensive estates had standalone rooms that were libraries. But even modest homes had a shelf with a Bible and maybe some Chaucer and so forth.
Shakespeare.
Where you would teach your children how to read using those texts. That's why I think we're screwed, because it's a revolution that has to begin from the ground up in teaching people how to be not critical thinkers, how to be autodidacts in the regime of wisdom. So that if university beckons and it's $95,000 a year, fine, go do that if you want to be a doctor or a lawyer or whatever. But it wouldn't be technically necessary for anybody else because they've already got the liberal arts in their soul.
Right. And the question that remains unasked essentially is, with all of this, cui bono? Who gains with all of this? And, it doesn't appear that the tech overlords are sensitive to that question, let's say. And so you and I would say that if you've been blessed with talent and fortune, that you have a certain responsibility. Let's say you're hyper agentic, you're hyper fortunate, you're hyper competent. We used to call those people aristocrats. And we used to say that the aristocrat has an obligation, the noble has an obligation to the rest of us, right? The whole idea of noblesse oblige. And what is remarkable to me, it seems, is that those that are architecting, building out this AGI utopia have no real sense of noblesse oblige. And I'm not sure how we get that across. I don't know.
I had a conversation with Louis Ayres the other night. He's from Great Britain, and so I was talking to him about my love for the TV show Downton Abbey. And I'm very aware of the fact that Julian Fellows, who produced it, also produced Upstairs, Downstairs.
Exactly.
And that what Julian Fellows always does is he shows us the drama of aristocrats who have this sense of noblesse oblige and how they treat their servants and the relationship of the servants to the aristocrats. Julian Fellows is smart enough to know that 98% of aristocrats did not act that way. That precisely because they lacked Christian virtue, the aristocracy fell apart. All right. Had they followed Rerum Novarum, the aristocracy, there was no noblesse oblige. So he romanticizes the aristocrats into saying, well, there were some that had this. Oh, I'm sure there were, but it wasn't a critical mass. So I don't think, in other words, there's that much of a difference between today's tech aristocracy and then the landed aristocracy of before. There's a reason why the peasants revolted against them, because it was so damned unfair. And there was no noblesse oblige. So you ask me, what lessons could Reverend Navarro teach us? That our tech aristocrats need to develop a sense of noblesse oblige. But, you know.
Yeah. So that's interesting. I like that idea, right? That at every new material epoch, right, you have to sort of renegotiate the sense of noblesse oblige, whether you're a knight on a horse or a master of industry or a master of our tech, a tech overlord. That it's we're going to have to continue to negotiate that. And again, and the axiom upon which all of that must rest is that in some weird, strange way, every one of us, the peasant, the poor is like us, and the tech overlords like them, every one of us is made in the image and likeness of God, right? Yes. And if you don't start from that, if you're not reminded of that radical assertion, that miracle, then bad stuff unfolds, right, in the aftermath of neglecting.
Sure does.
That. Yeah.
Sure does. The shice hits the fan.
Well, on that note, Larry, I will say this, ask you this, that, perhaps as a sort of a blessing of the Holy Spirit, that at this moment, which we seem to be facing, that seems so much different than a silly synod on synodality or a silly synod on whatever, right?
Yes,
we've been given, another opportunity, that grace, where sin is, grace abounds all the more. And so perhaps in this moment, we've been given another Leo to help us try to navigate our way through these upcoming choppy waters.
I agree. It's my prayer too. I'll just leave one last thing too.
Yeah.
How strange is it, in a refreshing way, that when a pope speaks in English, it's with clear American accents. It's not, be not afraid. God bless America.
Yeah.
John Paul. It's like, hey, dudes, I got something to tell you now.
Yeah.
It's like, wow.
Yeah, it's weird. It's weird. Yeah, it's wild. Pope Bob. Pope Bob.
That's
All
right.
right, well, Larry, thank you so much for finishing us off here. We did the Pope is dead, and then they're going to choose the Pope, and now we got one, and a week and a day or two in, it just feels so different, doesn't it? And I don't want to be naive about this stuff. Real world's the real world. A human being's a human being. Yeah. But it does feel like we've got a little bit of breath here, that the Holy Spirit blows again.
And I would like to encourage viewers to realize that the whole last half hour where we talk about AI is not irrelevant to that conversation.
Right.
Of the papacy, because Leo himself has brought this up.
Yeah, dude. All right. Well, thank you so much, Larry. Everybody in the chat, it's great having you here. We're gonna peace out here. Cheers, Larry. God bless. Get home safe.
Thanks. Bye.
All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Underneath Podcast.